This video summarizes the changes to the July 2019 edition of the RE16 Seller Representation Agreement. This would be a good point to note that any changes that are made to these representation agreements that are applicable will be carried forward into the compensation agreements as well. So even though we're not reviewing each one of those individually, it would be prudent to review all of the representation and compensation agreements as some of these changes will be carried forward. There's only one change to this agreement this year. It is a relatively subtle change, but it is eliminating a problem that probably a subtle problem, something that doesn't come up very often. However, when we have an opportunity, the committee likes to close any doors that could create any confusion or ambiguities in our contracts. This sentence that's added here on line 58 that states this section shall survive the term or termination of this agreement unless explicitly revoked in a written document signed by broker and client. The purpose of this sentence is to account for a situation that had come up previously, and it wasn't something that came up frequently, but when it did come up, it could create significant issues. And in fact, the one example that we saw, it did create a very large problem for the brokerage because they lost what would have been a very large commission for work that they had done. The example goes like this: the brokerage enters into a seller representation agreement with a client. That brokerage, in this particular circumstance, had worked very hard, had held open houses, had done a lot of work, posted some advertising in papers and things of this nature, had a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. The seller, of course, after some time went by, was disgruntled that they weren't receiving offers that they wanted. Although some offers did come in, ultimately the seller had rejected those, and so seller was blaming brokerage for the property not moving. The brokerage and the seller came to an agreement whereby they terminated the representation agreements. They used RE16A to do that, and you'll see that there's some changes made to the RE16 here in a little bit in another video that track along these same lines. But anyway, they used the RE16 to terminate a representation agreement. The seller then went back to one of the buyers that the brokerage had procured and said, hey, I no longer have to pay a commission, so therefore I can reduce my, what we're asking, and they basically intentionally and in bad faith cut the brokers out of the transaction. There is no doubt that the broker had procured the buyer. There is no doubt that the buyer was there as a result of all of the brokerage's efforts. So the brokerage then turned back around to the seller and said, wait a minute, that's not right. It's not fair. You owe us at least something, for this hard work that we've done. And we know that, this tail, which is what we call Section C, this tail applies. So they tried to use this paragraph to recover their commission, which they were owed. The seller hired a lawyer. The lawyer used some sort of creative nonsensical argument that because the representation agreement was terminated or canceled, that termination or that cancellation also terminated this subsection, and saying that when you canceled you as a brokerage, when you cancel a rep agreement, it somehow cancels this paragraph or this section, and so therefore the brokerage should not be able to go after the seller in this case. So having heard this story and seen kind of the transaction, how it went down, the committee felt it would be appropriate to add this sentence to the very end of this section to make it crystal clear that this section will survive the term or termination of this agreement. And there's these two. You'll notice the language used here is not cancel, it is term or termination. That will be explained a little bit further in the video relating to the 16A. We encourage you to review that video as well, because these are part and parcel of the same thing. That is the only change that was made to the representation agreement this year. And again, like we said at the beginning of the video, some of these changes will be carried forward into the other rep agreements or compensation agreements as applicable.